The night before the fleet was to leave the harbor, the city's breath slowed to a hush that made every sound a trespass. The sea spoke in its old tongue against stone and pilings, a patient syllabic hush, and the masts in the anchorage drew ink strokes across the faint band of stars. From the high terrace of the pyramid, lamplight fanned in scallops of gold and died before it reached the parapet, so that Daenerys stood half in the city and half in a darkness that was not the seas but something quieter. The pause before a vow is spoken. Below, Meereen lay like a box of coals, its alleys humming in the heat. She could smell fermented dates and cardamom, quenched kills and the iron sweetness of spilled blood that seemed never to leave the air here, even after peace and decrees and patient listening. The wind that came up from the water had passed over tarred rope and sun-bleached sailcloth and the backs of men bent at labor. It brought a laborer's breath to her cheek, honest and used up, and it made her think of all the promises she had put into the mouths of other people's mornings. "You should sleep," Missandei said at her shoulder, soft as a hand on a pulse. "They will work faster if they know you slept." Daenerys smiled for her, though sleep lay within her reach as a stranger might at the edge of a campfire, visible, wary, prepared to flee if spoken to. "I have slept before other crossings," she said, and found the memory more distant than she had thought. "Do you remember the river we followed out of Astapor? I dreamed of walking along the bottom, among sour stones and jars lost from boats, and then I woke with the feeling of mud in my teeth." "Tonight you will dream of wind," Missandei said. In the darkness, the girl's eyes were greater than her face. "The ships will make so much wind it will be enough to carry us all." The three pyramids were black triangles against a strip of silver cloud that the moon was trying to persuade. Farther out, where the city's lanterns bled, a constellation of fires marked the encampments of men who had once hunted her and now wore the name of her cause as if it had always belonged to them. The sea carried their laughter like shells in its pockets and returned it broken and smoothed. "Grey Worm says there is unrest in the brickmaker's quarter," Missandei added, and then was silent as if she had spoken into a jar. "It is nothing. He has quieted it. But he will keep the patrols close to the docks through the night." "I know," Daenerys murmured. "He told me." A gull wheeled once, twice, and then was gone as if it had simply chosen not to be. She had learned to trust the departures of things. The world grew under her like a tree grows under a child that has decided to climb it, and still she measured every step, telling herself the bark was smooth, the knots kind. The ships below her were her answer to every question she had refused to stop asking. "I wish to walk the quay," she said, and felt Missandei's breath catch as if on a thorn. "I will go cloaked. I wish to see them close." Missandei did not protest, but she wrapped Daenerys in a mantle that smelled faintly of lemon leaves and kept her eyes low. The corridors of the pyramid were a reliquary of heat where even the stone seemed to swallow its saliva. They passed through a hall where 3 braziers had been left to die and where each ember seemed to look up at them and then resume its private illness. At a side door, Grey Worm waited, still as a bronze figure against the sand-colored wall, a small constellation of torches at his back. His hand was bandaged where a knife had sought him earlier in the evening at the brickmaker's outer gate. "You will not go alone," he said without question. His choir of Unsullied thickened around them with a whisper of leather. He had chosen only 6, as she would have asked. She loved him for not making her ask. "I will go as I am," she said, and touched the clasp of her mantle. "I wish to smell the ships, not be seen by them." Grey Worm's eyes did not move to the clasp. "I will walk behind," he said, which was how he told her that he had already decided where each footprint should be placed. The hallway that led down to the service warren carried a breeze that was not precisely clean but was other than heat and that felt like a decision made elsewhere. Daenerys breathed it as medicine. Torchlight scraped across damp stones. On the last landing they came upon a boy asleep against a wine amphora. His head tipped back to show the arch of his throat, and Missandei's frown wove itself like a stitch. "Take him to a pallet," Daenerys said. "Say that the queen had a gentle night and that it was because he slept so well at his post." Missandei nodded and slipped back with 2 of the Unsullied, leaving Daenerys with 4 and Grey Worm. They emerged into a lane that ran along the outer wall and downward toward the docks. The city was a map of hush and the soft instinct of cats. At a courtyard where pigeons had once been sold, a man sat with his back to a pillar, his hands joined as if in prayer, and said nothing. She noted him as one notes an unseasonable plant. Grey Worm's glance flicked like a bead on a string across the shadows. His head did not move. When they reached the quay, she felt, all at once, the nearness of departure as one feels the nearness of rain, a pressure without a touch. The ships, her ships, massed in the anchorage like geese unnaturally obedient, their prows subdued beasts facing the same word. A brazier burned at the end of the quay and painted iron chains and coils of rope with an old armor's color. Men moved in the dark with the profound efficiency of those who had long loved their bodies in danger and wished to keep loving them. A barrel rolled. The sea shouldered the stones and then settled back, content with its own patience. A woman rose from a crouch at the base of a bollard as if she had grown there. Her hair was wrapped in indigo cloth, her gown a merchant style that refused to confess to any particular city. "My queen," she said, and her voice was low enough to seem a shadow of itself. "Forgive the hour. Master of the fleet said you would walk. He asked I show you a curiosity." She twisted beside the brazier and drew out a small coffer of dark wood. Its corners were iron-banded, its lid inlaid with a design of coiled dragons in some pale stone. "We do not accept gifts from strangers," Grey Worm said before Daenerys could speak. "Not on this night." The woman dipped her head, a movement that could as easily have been a smile had it not been for the absence of teeth. "Not a gift," she said, "a token to be examined and returned. It belonged to sailors who traded in Karth. The inlay is bone of some creature they said dwelt in ruins there, bat or other thing. But it is what is within that the master of the fleet desired your eye for. He has never seen its like." Daenerys watched Grey Worm watching the box. The coffer itself was nothing more than what one might find under a junk seller's sheet in a market too near the docks. But the woman's voice had the quality of sand that has absorbed oil. It did not change, it took on a weight that was not its own and did not relinquish it. The brazier's flame had guttered to a tongue that licked the iron as if to heal it. "What is within?" Daenerys said, keeping her voice calm so that Grey Worm would not have to say no twice. The woman did not open the coffer. She lifted it with both hands as one might a bird that has broken nothing yet refuses to fly, and offered it upward, wrists visible, unadorned. "I have not seen," she said. "Men tell me it is a glass egg. A poor trick of fate that the word should be that on this night on this quay." Grey Worm looked at Daenerys the way a door looks at its house. She nodded, and he stepped forward, taking the box as if he were lifting a load he wished to hear complain. "If there is venom," he began. "I will smell it," Daenerys said, and came near enough that the brazier warmed the back of her hand. The wood had a faint sour tease, as if it had spent too long where it should not. The lid lifted without protest. Within lay a sphere wrapped in gauze, a shimmering like winter breath where oil had touched it. Grey Worm drew the gauze aside with 2 careful fingers and uncovered a glass that had the faint iridescence of shells stolen from riverbeds, greens and blues, and a copper whisper that her eyes made into memory. It was the size of a clenched fist, heavier than it looked by how it sat. Somewhere within its glass a fleck caught the firelight and refused to let it go. She did smell something, faint, not the usual breath of burning pitch and salted wood, not a perfume. A bitter almond, a stone broken by a river. "There are many glass eggs in the world," she said softly, and the woman inclined her head, complicit. "The world is an extravagant liar, let us be particular." "But not with this," the woman murmured, and with a movement so small that Daenerys felt, rather than saw, the shift, she pressed her thumb against a metal-catching piece at the sphere's throat. A seam that she had not noticed unknit, and gave a sigh, delicate as a child's certainty. From within, something breathed out, not a vapor and not a scent, a coolness like mint set upon a wound. The bitterness strengthened, then slid under the mind's door. Grey Worm stepped back a pace, his face the same as it had been upon the door of many rooms of death. The world rotated half a degree. The brazier's small flame had an edge. The sea's hush placed itself upon her chest, and she found it natural, so natural, to draw breath a small shade deeper. Her body told her that the air had thinned in kindness and must be seized with gratitude. She closed the coffer by instinct, not panic. If she were to startle breath into her throat, the air would take advantage. Her mouth tasted of apricot stone and then of something like old copper. On either side of her, the Unsullied had already shifted, closing the space as water finds its old beds. Grey Worm's hand went to her shoulder and then did not, because he had not taken breath and saw that hers were now numbered. "Back," he said, one word whose syllable was stone. "Back." The world did what a spinning toy does when a child taps its nose. The brazier tilted. The coffer slipped out of Grey Worm's hands toward the woman who had never promised anything. She did not catch it. She stepped aside, and sudden darkness opened where she had been standing. Two figures rose from the water on either side of the quay, their hair slicked flat, their eyes bare as fish eyes. Nets with weighted knots blossomed in their hands and closed the way a mussel closes. Not thrown to trap, but to interrupt. The first mesh settled on Grey Worm's shoulders, the second against the Unsullied to the right. The knots jolted where they struck bone. Three others appeared as if the water had been pregnant with them. They did not scream, and that was what let them be near so long. Silence is not menacing until it chooses to be in company. Daenerys drew breath to cry for the dragon who would come if air allowed him to hear his name inside her blood. The bitter almond thrust itself soft and inexorable across her throat. A hand came from behind, clean, efficient, cool fingers like a surgeon's, and a mask of damp linen pressed to her mouth. The first breath she took into it was water on a winter morning. The second slid gently a curtain across the theater of her skull. She did not go down in fear or in fussing. It was like the last moment of a fever when the body decides it has done enough for either life or death and turns a face to whichever hand has been kindest. She woke to wood and the whisper of it. Her cheek lay on planks that had spoken with tar. They were warm with the press of sun that had long since slid off them into someone else's darkness. She woke between breaths, the way one wakes when one has been listening to a song and then remembers it is one's own name. The movement of the ship was so mild at first she mistook it for her pulse. But as her pulse learned it and matched it, she understood where her body had been carried. There was light without shape. There was the smell of oil, salt, iron that had been recently washed and so wore its thoughtfulness like a veil. She raised her head and the world sighed because the world's balance is not made for one woman's rising. Her wrists felt a sorrow that had been carefully applied. The cords were knotted with the affection of a workman for a job done to the line. A chain lay against her ankle, its weight a kind of discourse that pretends to be intimate. Someone had been thorough. Someone had been very near her while she was most herself and had borrowed pieces of her without asking. Her breath, the warmth of her skin, the sound her lips made when parted and moved not at all. She lay in a cabin with no ornaments. A single bench built from the body of the ship ran the length of one wall. A jug sat upon the deck in the corner, and a bitter little window, the kind that knows its own futility, let in a bar of sea that did not touch her. The hatch was closed from without. She waited. Listening is the first thing one offers to circumstance when one means to live through it. Overhead, the ship was a city of wood. Footfalls drummed a grammar learned on many seas. She could distinguish the talkers, those men who stubbed the ends of their words into the deck for fear the wind would carry them off, and the men with no tongues at all, whose feet wrote nothing, whose silence was not reticence but the shape of their mouths. She remembered tales of a ship where all the crew were mutes and where the captain kept their tongues in a purse or wore them as a belt. People embroider the truth so that it matches the garments they need. But that a man had made it his habit to cut out the instruments by which men say why they did things, that she believed. She drew her legs under her and touched the chain, testing the way a dancer tests a stage. It had given very slightly under strain. That was information, not instruction. She looked to the window and then away from it. It would teach her the sea's temper, not the men's. Someone came to the hatch. The sound of the latch was reverent. like a prayer said in a tongue the speaker no longer understands but refuses to abandon. The door opened inward, and a boy with hair the color of cliffs bleached by wind set down a wooden tray with a metal cup and 2 pieces of bread that had once known wheat and now knew salt. His eyes never lifted. A scar ran from ear to collar. Not a sword story, a knife story, a tidy decision. He placed the tray where she could reach it and turned, the chain at his ankle weeping its small complaint. He had no tongue, she saw, when his mouth opened briefly to catch his breath. He took in air as one takes a lesson. "Thank you," she said. Her voice sounded to her as it had long ago when she had been in a tent and the silk had made her feel small. A voice wearing a sound new to it. The boy paused. He looked at her hands, then at the chain, measured them with his own wrists by habit, perhaps by instruction. He pointed. 2 taps to his chest with open fingers, then 1 to the door. He was not telling her his name. He was telling her that he would return. "Do that. Return," she murmured. "And bring a knife next time." She smiled at him with a grace she had learned from a man long dead. The boy's eyes, gray as the sea in a mood that did not mean to be read, flickered. He left without haste, which meant he had not been explicitly ordered to fear her, or it meant he had lived a very long time without instruction. The bread was not unkind. The water was water. She ate as one does when one knows the body will be asked for steadiness. She did not drink to wash down fear. Fear is not a thing one can swallow. It is a thing that insists on being introduced to every bone by name. The hatch reopened when she had finished. The one who entered did not bring light so much as make the light that was already there decide to show itself. He had the kind of smile that is not an expression but a possession, something inherited like a piece of jewelry, often worn, never polished. His hair hung in curls that the salt had taught to obey. He wore no crown, but his rings had the glint of promises other men had made to him and then kept for him by dying. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice came from his throat in the way a sailor's does when he has taught his body to ride every course of wind. "I have longed to meet you at sea. You belong to it, so they say. Born, was it in storm? The sea likes claiming its own. Give me your name if you intend to fill the room so," she said and sat straighter, which made the chain at her ankle translate itself into another language and then back into the same one, just to show her it could. He laughed the way a mast laughs when a wind tries to make it weep. "A woman who asks for a name, that's rare and gratifying. Men demand I remind them of mine and then pretend to have known it since their mothers were girls. Euron, Euron Greyjoy, King of the Iron Islands by the grace of terror and convenience, captain of this vessel. Do you like her? She's called the Silence. She is shy among landsmen, but you, perhaps, she might make an exception for. I have heard tales of you," she said. "They were not pretty. Tales are quilts stitched by cold hands from scraps. But yes," he said, agreeable as a host who has laid out too much meat. "Some corners are accurate. There are prettier captains and uglier ships. There are prettier kings and uglier prayers. And what have you undertaken?" She did not look at the boy who had brought water, though she wished to mark whether he would be rebuked for having left her with wrists untied. The boy had disappeared, one silent gesture back into the seam of the ship. Euron spread his hands, showing she might count rings if she wished. Undertaken? More a promise kept. A queen in Westeros asked a king of the Isles to bring her a gift that could not be mistaken for anything but the shape of its value. What do men do who wish to marry? They bring father's skins and mother's cheeses and daughter's trinkets. When the bride is a realm, the trinket should be something no other bride can pretend to have. You, my dear, are precisely that. His teeth were very white. The lines around his eyes were like cracks that had learned a language of their own. He wore a piece of bone around his throat that had once belonged to a creature who had swum perhaps deeper than he would ever go himself. His boots were soft, his balance perfect, his regard a thing not customarily refused. She remembered a man who had once been a king and who had hidden his madness in the folds of ceremony. This one wore whatever madness he owned as if it were a perfume by which he recognized himself in a crowd. "If you bring me to her," Daenerys said. "You will be bringing your end with your prize." She felt the chain like a company she had not invited and so turned her ankle until it found a place to rest. "You will be one more name upon a list that was long before you were born." "Ah," Euron said softly. "A list. Who among us doesn't love to keep one? I prefer inventories. Lists never show you what you have to trade for the thing you want next. But you, child of boiling water, you think lists are vows. That is charming. No, do not bite me." And he wagged a finger, not at her but at something in his head. He leaned against the door with a familiarity that was not contempt. He understood wood and it him. "You will find your dragons poor sailors. They will look in the wrong places and burn the wrong boats, aunt. I'll someone throws a pig into a fire and the smoke smells like your name to them. But my route is cleverer than your boys are hungry. You cut the tongues out of your men," she said, "because mercy sometimes wears the shape of another subject. Does your ship sail straighter for it? It moves with less complaint," he said. "The sea loves silence. Have you listened properly? It tells you things when you stop insisting on hearing yourself answer. You'll learn, if you make it to shore with your ears unspoiled." He glanced at her chain, not unkindly. "Do not test the iron, little sea queen. It does not fall in love." "Nor do I," she said, and made the words as light as a thrown gull feather. He grinned. "Lies told prettily are an art. One day we will discuss our favorite ones." He straightened. "The Strait of Skulls can be a temperamental crossing. You will feel very little of it. I have a hand on this ship the way a man has a hand on a woman he knows better than she knows herself and loves worse. There will be 3 ports where we take water. There will be one whether sent by a god who used to be called something else. There will be a song that you will think you do not hear because you prefer not to, but you will hear it. Do not dream of commanding these days by staring at their faces. They do not look back." He tapped the jam with 2 fingers as if to wake the wood, and left as if he had been called to an altar only he could see. Her breath went in and out and in and out. The sea drew its wet signature along the hull. She thought of a woman with a mask who had told her that to go west she must go east, and decided that perhaps hearing had always been a kind of coin she had spent too freely. The boy with the gray eyes returned in the 14th hour. She had not counted them. She had listened to them. He carried a rag and a small pot of some grease that smelled faintly of tallow and of pine resin. He kneeled at her ankle and examined the place where iron had placed its argument against bone. He looked up once and then away, a field creature noting the wind's change and then resuming its nibbling because what else is there? He touched the chain with 2 fingers delicately and then, with a little authority, slid the grease along her skin under the iron's lip. "You have a kind pair of hands," she said. "What did you do before your mouth was closed?" He looked at her. A question shaped his face the way wind shapes a dune. Slowly, insistently. He mimed a line heaving, a net drawing up, a basket tilting. "A fisherman," she guessed. He nodded slowly. Another creature reclaiming its old legs after having been turned into something new to please a god. He raised his left hand, palm down, and drew an invisible line along its back. A net? Or a hook? A mark? She touched her own hand where he had drawn and made the shape of a fish's mouth opening and closing. He laughed without sound and then with sound, for laughter is a body surprise and makes itself a sound even when the mouth is not in the habit. Came out like a cough's cousin. "What is your name?" she asked, and then regretted it. A person who has lost his tongue often grows attached to the part of his body that replaces it. Names were dangerous. They turned strangers into kin. He drew a shape in the grease on her ankle that looked like an eye and then a little wave. Then he rubbed it away at once and glanced at the door. She understood. He had been told not to write. He had been told not to allow his hands to become a tongue. He had been made labor, not language. She addressed him, then, in the language of tasks. "Will you bring me more water each time before the bell? No wine. It dulls the ear." He nodded and continued his work with the grease, gentle and thorough, a priest in charge of a god's bruises. That first night at sea in captivity, she dreamed of a shore where no water moved and the sky had nothing to do. She stepped on the shore and felt under her feet bones. So many bones that it was impossible to find something else to place the soul upon. She bent and lifted one, light as a bird. It had been hollow once, the better to be filled with air for flight. Now it was a cup for night. She filled it with light that did not ask to be held and drank, and woke with the taste of metal on her tongue and the sound of Euron singing in a voice men would kill to escape. They hugged the coast, then did not, then returned to it as if to prove to the sea that they had that freedom. Twice they stopped. Once at a limestone cove where women with their hair under dull cloth came down with baskets of shells and old knives to trade for oil and powder, and once at a black beach where a man with a scar that ran from nostril to navel brought them 3 goats tied on a rope. She watched through the small window, closing one eye to make a circle of clearer sight, and saw nothing of the world that the world would recognize. All the divorces of men from men and men from land and land from water occurred beyond the frame of her view and sounded like another ship's timbers speaking in their sleep. Each day the boy returned. Each day he brought water, bread, and once, a piece of salted fish that her mouth forgave. He rubbed grease beneath the iron, and she told him a story with her hands. First, she told him of the time she had walked a city's alleys with a dragon above her, and how the dragon had spread its shadow over men who had forgotten what shadows are for. Then she told him how one requires a very precise quiet to listen to the way sand remembers every foot. The boy listened with his neck and with a small muscle just below his right eye. He made the shape of a boat with his palms and set it on his knee and tilted it. He believed boats carried women rarely and with difficulty. She set the little boat, with a touch of a fingertip, upon her thumb and made it balance. The boy blinked. A smile envied his lips and then did not take them. On the 5th day, the sea decided to describe itself by beating against another sea and making a violence of love with the wind. The hull complained. The ropes said their most practiced prayers. Euron laughed as a man laughs when he wants the gods to think him confident even if he is. The boy did not come that night. On the 6th, a jar of water appeared by her door without knock or face. She drank in small sips and spat one out onto the plank, tasting it the way one tastes a stranger's story. She slept in increments, waking to count a soft knock that came somewhere within the ship's bones. 3, 5, 7. Something that had once mattered to someone. When Euron returned, he was in a mood like rough silk. "We have played with a storm," he said. "It was reluctant, but I persuaded it to be generous. You are a lucky charm. Very lucky, perhaps. One day we will see if that luck is attached to your breath or to your bones." "Men who speak thus have already decided their answers," she said. She had learned that in Meereen, in a court that had been hers until it had taught her how many courts are no one's. "Your storm left you something, then, that you like." He looked at her as if measuring whether the use of the word left was impertinence or prophecy. "I am brought by it something that I requested long ago," he said, more sober than wine permits. "A wind that will take us faster than we should go. I intend to use it." He leaned his head, looked at her through that morning's humor. "Do not fear, I will parade you on a deck with a gag while I drink from your vulnerability. I am more subtle than that and more practical. I have been tasting my bride's patience, not my prize's panic." She thought of the word bride and saw, not Cersei's face, which she had never seen in person, but a door made of iron with a tree's heart set within it, oiled and smelling faintly of tallow. A door that would open only one way and would not forgive those who missed the moment to pass through. "Tell me of your queen," she said. "What does she want?" "Everything. She has none of the modesty that makes women savory, but all of the appetite that makes them splendid. She wears cruelty as you might wear a veil, practical to keep the flies off. She suspects love of treason. She prefers loyalty that can be measured in bodies stacked and counted. She has a mouth that has tasted the worst the world offers and learned to find it insufficient." He smiled. "You will like her. The two of you will talk without speaking." "And in your tale," Daenerys said. "What do you get?" "Myself," Euron said. "And when a man like me finds himself with a woman like that, the gods take notes." There was something about the way he said it that made her think of a man looking into a mirror and seeing not only his own present face but what it had cost. He left without further charm. She put her ear to the plank and listened to the sea telling her the simplest of stories. I will be here when you are not. In the 14th night, she dreamed of a large room lit by candles that had learned not to drip. In the center of the room stood a woman in iron gray who lifted a cup of wine and drank it like medicine. A man with hair like spun wheat stood at her shoulder, his mouth set as if the maker had forgotten to carve it into a smile. The woman looked at Daenerys as if she had always known her at a distance and would now prefer to forget that. Daenerys woke with a taste of ashes, though nothing had burned. They came into a fog so delicate that it considered the air beneath it. Euron's men moved like a prayer said in a language forbidden and so learned in secret. Horns lowed on a shore somewhere. Bells answered in an old harbor. She knew, by the stink of old fire and rats in walls and water that remembered blood, that they had not merely reached a city but one that had been briefly convinced it was the center of the world and had loved itself for it. The little window showed almost nothing. The hatch opened and two men with arms like ropes lifted her. Neither had tongues. Neither looked at her as a man looks at a woman. They looked at her as carpenters look at a beam, useful if treated strictly. A hood went over her head, that old trick, that theater by which those who are afraid of looking are not required to confess to it. She felt the air change, get thicker, then thinner, then touched by the scent of stones that have been kept near heat but never allowed to drink it. Walls warmed by hearths but not loved by them. Steps, the kind that remember kings. A gate's groan that could have been either rust or memory. A silence that was not the ship's, and yet she found she missed the ships for a breath. When the hood was removed, she stood in a chamber made to break men without rudeness. Its walls bore iron rings whose dispositions had been decided by men who had trained horses once and had brought their best techniques to bear upon those who did not deserve them. The window was long and narrow and looked down upon a courtyard where a few men trained in the old way under the eye of a woman whose hair was the color of a raven that had dipped its wing in white paint. Daenerys was placed on a stool. The chain was attached to a ring. What the world had to say it would say to her in this room. Qyburn came first, which made a horrid sort of sense. He wore the robes of a man whom institutions had taught to be quiet in the presence of power, even when speaking. His smile did not show teeth. His eyes were those of a man who liked watching a problem at the moment before it solved itself. "Your Grace," he said, and made of the title exactly what one makes of a spoon, something common that nevertheless feeds. "We are pleased beyond phrases to welcome you. The Queen asks that I attend you while arrangements are made." He glanced at the ring, at her ankle, at the chafe. "I see someone has administered balm. How thoughtful of them." He sounded as if he were noting that some unknown colleague had taken an interest in his case. "Your name?" she asked, though she knew it. His letters had crept across Essos in the mouths of men who had survived being cured by him. It was a ritual to require a man to name himself within the work he happened to be doing to another. "Qyburn," he said, not irritated by repetition. "A servant of the Queen and of knowledge. Your dragons are well. You will not touch them," she said, "and let the breath in the sentence be what the sentence made of it. You have devised devices that throw bolts further than an archer's pride. You will not throw them at my children and expect me to applaud your ingenuity." He smiled again, and the smile was like a trap with the rust rubbed off. "If, by some miracle, your children were to present themselves, my dear lady, we would take certain measures, but of course we would prefer them not to. The Queen is practical. She does not waste her own stores of fire while testing whether others are flameproof." He stood an arm's length from her and measured that distance with his comfort. "The Queen would speak with you at table. Not a spectacle," he hastened to add. "Not yet. Conversation. She likes those whom others call queens. She wishes to see what the word does when it places itself upon different shoulders." Daenerys could not help it. She laughed. It came up from the place in her where laughter has been waiting to see whether it will be allowed to die. "You are a student of women," she said. "You speak as if we are puzzles whose pieces are laid in your lap by gods. He bowed a fraction to the work rather than to her. I am a student of bodies and of the expressions they put upon themselves. Women, men, both are the same in the moment of pain or joy, and I have attended both. The Queen will see you after the third bell tomorrow, if there is no interruption. You are well? Have you any request that is reasonable within the context of your current situation? Water, she said, and then, after a beat, and a comb. The addition was not vanity. It was a claim to the ongoing shape of a person. He registered it and nodded, making a note within himself. When he left, she stood. The chain allowed 5 steps and a small act of rebellion, to turn her back on the window and look at the door as if it were a friend who had not yet decided whether to visit. She combed her hair when the comb came, and the small teeth found salt in it and sand that had traveled with her since the old crossings. She did not cry. Tears are a kind of currency she had spent elsewhere at better rates. The woman who trained men in the yard below lifted her sword, demonstrating a cut that began near the shoulder and ended precisely where a heart would be if men wore theirs under their left eyes. She shouted a word that might have been a name, and a boy ran to retrieve a dropped helm. The courtyard stones were clean the way soldiers clean things, by making them bleed often and wipe often. In another part of the keep, someone began to play a high little pipe whose tune had once accompanied dancers. Now it accompanied a woman combing her hair while chained to a wall. Cersei came to her as a woman might come upon a deer she intends both to admire and to skin. She wore a gown that could have been armor if she had willed it so. The gold in its threads thought very highly of itself. Her hair lay like a verdict. She dismissed everyone with a flick that showed she believed in the efficacy of such movements, and sat upon a chair more finely made than the room deserved. So, Cersei said, you came after all. You sent for me, Daenerys said. One corner of Cersei's mouth answered. Did I? I sent for a raider to bring me something that would make noisy men take vows. I didn't specify you. There are other queens. They multiply when there's blood around like flies. You should close your windows then, Daenerys said, and hoped Missandei would forgive her for borrowing the rye. Cersei looked appreciatively at the audacity, at the chain, at the woman who wore it. Your dragons, she said, as if they were accessories. What a pity there are only 3. A pity there are not more, or a pity there are any at all? Daenerys asked. She could take this measure. This woman liked tasting sentences. Both? Cersei said, and stood, restless with the kind of energy that turns vines bitter. Had there been 9, I might have burned the world before you arrived and saved myself time. With 3, one has to aim. I was told you wished to aim them at me. It's flattering. So many have aimed things at me. Men, children, spears, promises. You have better toys. I admire a woman who collects the best pieces on the board. Will you marry the man who fetched me? Daenerys asked. Will you accept that he believes himself your equal and then discover that he was wrong? You will not forgive being wronged in the same breath as being surprised. Cersei's stare put a little mark on the air between them. I don't marry men who can only take. I marry men who can be taken from. There is a difference. You have killed your priests and your kings, Daenerys said coolly. I have killed men who put collars on children. It is a difference. It is an illusion, Cersei said without malice. We both killed those who stood between ourselves and the thing we desired. What is it you desire? Daenerys asked, though she knew that was a question one asks not for an answer but to place a mirror between a woman and her mouth. Everything, Cersei said, and smiled as Euron had said she would, and to see those who tried have nothing. They spoke thus a long while, testing the limits of language's ability to bruise. Cersei did not ask about dragons with a child's stupid hunger. She was more subtle. She asked about how a woman becomes a symbol against her will, and how that symbol shapes men's illusions before they realize they are still men and hunger still demands to be fed. Daenerys answered as a woman might who had once made herself into a symbol because everyone else had insisted she was one, and because she preferred to choose the manner of her own mythology. Words crossed the space like javelins. None stuck, for both had shields named for their dead. After Cersei left, the room held her perfume for a time, a crisp floral married to a bitterness that might once have been an orange peel. Daenerys breathed it and thought of gardens that have learned to grow flowers for knives. At dusk, a man stood in the doorway and did not speak until she looked at him long enough that he would forgive himself for having come. His hair was the color of the straw in old stables. His face lined not only from frowning but from refusing to. He wore a leather glove on his right hand that had nothing to do with weather. "Jaime Lannister," he said, offering the name as one might offer a piece of bread. "Accept it. Do not make me be sorry I offered. If I were a story you heard by a fire long ago, I would say something about fathers and debts. If I were a priest, I would confess. As it is, I am a man who is tired and who wishes to look at you without someone else turning it into policy. You are the Queen's brother," she said, "and once a king's guard. And now a queen's guard," he said. "I have been a guard so long I no longer remember whether it is an honor or a habit." He did not come near. He looked at the iron on her ankle as if he were looking at his own hand. He sighed, and it sounded like leather creasing. "Do you know that my house murdered your family?" "I was told," she said, and saw a boy standing in a doorway with a crown too heavy for his neck, a woman whose hair had come loose with fear, a corridor and the smell of blood and wax. She had been told, yes. She had also been told that men with golden hair could lie so fluent. Ly they no longer knew which syllables were true. "Every day since I have been told it," he said. "It wakes with me and pours the first cup." He looked up from iron and met her eyes. They were a color that the sky favors on a day when rain threatens and decides against it. "I cannot ask your pardon. Your pardon is not a thing I have earned. But I can ask that when you speak my name to your counselors after you leave here, if you leave here, you will not say only the word that men say when they spit." "What word do they say when they spit?" she asked, curious despite herself. "Kingslayer," he said, as if he were reading it on his own skin. "They do not ask what king or why. Perhaps they aren't interested in the answer. Answers make lies less comfortable." "I have been told why," she said softly, "and I have seen a city that would have loved a man for doing it. You saved lives. Or so you were told to tell yourself." He smiled, crooked as a bone that has set itself. "It is the story I repeated until it put a pillow under my head. Perhaps it is true. Perhaps it is useful. Perhaps they are the same thing." He looked at her hair, now tamed by the comb's teeth. "You remind me of someone who sang once in a camp by a river. He would have liked you. He was my sister's husband." "Rhaegar," she whispered, and the name cut her lips gently as it left. "I know him only by lullaby and accusation. I never heard him sing." "Then I'm glad I did," he said, and the relief in it hurt more than she had expected. "I do not know what I am doing here. Perhaps a man comes to see his conscience in daylight and has to remind himself he is still the same shape. I will bring you news when news is kind. I will bring you silence when it isn't. Bring me a hairpin," she said, and when he raised an eyebrow she smiled without teeth. "For my hair." He looked at her, at the chain, at the thin long window, and he smiled, just a little, with something like respect or fear. He left without promising anything. Men who have kept too many promises are careful with the next ones. The days that followed were a veil. She learned the rhythm by which servants approached. Qyburn stepped like a spider who had learned to mimic a man's. The page with hair like wheat whose eyes would not leave the floor. The girl with a birthmark the shape of a bean on her jaw who brought vinegar and water in alternate mornings and always looked as if she had betrayed someone recently. She learned the bells, which were not like Marine's, and the trumpets, which had a brassy disdain that made her teeth hurt. She learned the way the wind came into the slit of window and how it favored one side of the room every afternoon as if that part of the room had paid. She learned the faces of two ravens that had made the opposite roof their argument and who cawed in voices that sounded like mine and never. She dreamed often. In one dream, Drogon came to her window and peered in with one yellow eye larger than the sun, and she touched the scales near it and burned her fingers in a way that did not harm. In another, she walked through a hall whose ceiling was made of ribs, and at the end of which a woman waited behind a glass door and told her that to unlock it she would need to ask it a question she did not want the answer to. In another, She sat at a table with Cersei, and between them lay a map where oceans were painted pale and land was wine-dark. And each moved her finger across a different sea and found they were moving toward the same small island. Euron came only once more. He wore a cloak the color of a bruise and laughed as if the moon had told him a secret. "The queen is restless," he said. "She will make a theater of you." I told her not to. She said she knew the audience by name. "You want me for yourself," she said, and found that she could say it the way one identifies a plant in a field. "You want to have been the only man who dared and therefore the only one who deserved. That is a child's way of loving." His eyes did something hers did not like. "Perhaps," he said, "but children get fed, while those who are noble starve prettily." "You cut tongues," she said. "No one will tell you when the food is poison." He grinned and spread his hands. "Life is poison. One learns to drink the doses that make the blood glitter. When you stand before the people, ask yourself what you want them to remember. Then forget it. They will invent you anyway." He wagged his head, a little as if the ship still rocked. "I will marry your enemy. She will wear me until she can't, and then she'll hang me from a wall. We each bring one another the deaths we wish to deserve." When he left, she found she was trembling. It wasn't fear. It was a tremor that began in bone and worked outward, like the shiver a horse gives when a fly lands between its muscles. Something was coming. The air had been taught by many generations of whispers and had learned to prepare itself this way. The hairpin arrived wrapped in a cloth that once had been white. It had a simple head and a serviceable point. Could lift a knot, loosen a screw, open a vein. It smelled faintly of oil and of a woman whose fingers had known flour. A token, a lever, the difference is the hand that holds it. The boy with gray eyes came to her that night with water and a piece of cheese. Rarer fare. He stood by the chain and looked at her ankle, then at her hand. He made a motion like pulling thread through cloth. She nodded. "Yes, stitch, yes, small things together, yes, all the way through." He pointed at the pin, then at the chain. His eyes asked more than his hands. She shook her head. "Not now." He looked disappointed and then in awe, as children do when they see a parent deny them a sweet and understand that denial is love. "We will not be foolish," she told him. "We will not be what they assume." She did not know whether he understood the words, but he understood the tone, the way a mother's dear prisoner does. He touched the grease at her ankle, pressing it into the skin, a small sacrament. The morning of the theater dawned bleached. The city smelled of old smoke. The bells named the hour with the dull certainty of instruments that had told joy and grief and so had grown cautious of their power. Qyburn came with 2 red-cloaked men and a woman who would brush Daenerys' hair so that the watching people would see a queen even when they were meant to see a captive. The comb went through without catching. The hairpin sat in the hair like a secret that does not know whether to be told. The chain was unhooked. Her ankle felt briefly naked. They brought her to a gallery above a hall where a throne sat like a creature made of knives that had forgotten their owners. The throne wore a woman and the woman wore a smile that a wolf might approve of. The hall wore people. Men in boots that had learned flattery. Women whose minds were keeping tapes of everything. Boys who gaped. Old men who had seen too much and wished to see this if only because it would be one more brick in the wall they had decided to lean against until death. Euron stood at the foot of the dais. His cloak like the beginning of a storm the hall had not yet noticed. Jaime stood to the left with his mouth in its usual best shape for regret. Qyburn hovered like bad air. They brought her down the steps. The chain whose weight she had learned to make nothing of was gone, and the absence felt like a promise and a trick. She walked as she had learned to walk among the Dothraki, with the hips not swaying but knowing where they were, as she had learned to walk among the freedmen, with the eyes seeing and the mouth kind, as she had learned to walk among those who would love her for a burn and then forget. She walked as herself, which is harder than walking as a queen. "Behold," Cersei said, and the single word was not loud and yet it filled the hall. "The mother of monsters, a breaker of things that did not need breaking." Daenerys halted and let her hands fall at her sides. She had no chain to rise and fall with her breath, and so her breath did not permit itself to show. "I am Daenerys," she said. and her voice made the sort of patch upon silence that women's voices do in rooms where it is believed that only men's carry. I am the daughter of a man who burned and of a woman who did not, and so I learned early the difference between heat and light. There was a murmur because there must always be a murmur to feed the theater. Cersei smiled and raised her hand, not to silence but as a habit that recognized that silence would please her. You are a child who imagines that because she sat a saddle and crossed hot seas she is a storm. The truth is the storm was there long before you spilled your first milk. Men have always burned each other when it suits them. You are one more excuse. And you, Daenerys said, are the aftermath that pretends to be an answer. The hairpin lay heavy in her hair. She could feel it as if it had a pulse. It was not a trial. It was a choreography in which one woman reminded a city that there is one of her and another woman reminded the same city that there could have been two. The words were fine, and the men who put them into their ears liked the taste of them the way boys like to chew on bits of leather. What mattered was the air, changed around them. It learned the shape of a new possibility, that two queens could speak to one another like peers and enemies and that the world need not end. That change frightened everyone who had assembled because fear steals quickly when the heart is already prepared. When it was done, when Cersei had called on mercy as a mantle she had decided to throw off and put on again with a theatrical exasperation, when the gold cloaks had pretended to place a hand upon Daenerys' shoulder and then had actually done it, when Euron had clapped and laughed and bowed and looked around to see who had seen him do it, Daenerys was led back up the steps. The chain returned 2 links, 10, familiarity like a stupid animal. Her room welcomed her with the absence of welcome that meant it was honest. She sat and listened to the keep settle into whatever thoughts keeps have when they are tired of holding men's schemes like a mother holds a disobedient child. The boy with gray eyes came in with water. He set it down and then, swift as a fish's truth, slipped a small folded paper under the jug with 2 fingers. He stood, his heart beat high in his throat. She made no motion that might guard the paper from eyes that had learned to see such things. He left. She listened with her fingers to the jug, then sipped, then waited. The day's light moved along the wall like the memory of a lover one has left 10 years too late and still misses. When the shadows had arranged themselves in a manner that the city and its watchers considered normal, she lifted the jug as if to drink, and the small square of paper fell into her lap as a leaf does. She unfolded it under the table. The script was a careful hand taught by someone who valued both clarity and the future. It said only, "Tonight, 3rd watch." It was not signed. It need not be. Secrets have better manners than that. She folded it 3 times and slipped it into the seam of the bench where the wood had split and learned to live with its own imperfection. She lay down without removing anything. Sleep did not so much come as consent. She dreamed of a field where the grass burned without dying and men ran through it asking for water while knowing that what they wanted was to learn how to burn like that. She woke to the 3rd watch and to footsteps outside the door, a murmur at a distance, a small collision of metal and constraint the way the night collides with itself when it must carry more secrets than usual. The latch lifted without ceremony. Jaime stood with the hairpin in his hand. Behind him, the girl with the bean mark on her jaw held a small lantern whose flame wished to be anywhere else. Jaime's face had a set to it that reminded her of the way a harness sits upon a horse that has made peace with being ridden. "We will not be able to conduct you very far," he said, "but we can get you to a door." "A door," she said, and remembered the iron with the tree heart, oiled and smelling of tallow. "A postern," he said. "There are men who have been told to look for those leaving, not those entering. It is a habit of kings to suspect that people will flee. Queens expect visitors." He nodded to the girl, who went to the chain and lifted the hook with hands that had done so before. She did not meet Daenerys' eyes while she worked. Her little lantern breathed on the iron. The hook came free with a sound like a coin flicked to say yes. Daenerys stood. The hairpin pricked her scalp as if to remind her of its future. Jaime offered her a cloak. She took it. In its fold lay a knife so modest it seemed ashamed of itself. She slid it across her palm and hid it in the way that women hide such things, a way that men do not expect because men believe themselves the only creatures patient with pain. "Thank you," she said, and knew that gratitude to men such as these is not a coin to be thrown lightly. It returns, sometimes with teeth. "We do this because it suits us," Jaime said. "Do not thank us as if we had become different men. I thank you because I am the sort of woman who cannot be made into what she refuses to name," she said. "It suits me." He smiled with his eyes only. "Hurry." They moved through the corridors as if they belonged to the stone itself. The little lantern accompanied them like a tame star. At a stair, the girl put the lantern out and they descended with their feet remembering shapes. At a turn, a voice said a name that belonged to no one present. Jaime pressed her gently against the wall, and the wall, to her surprise, felt warm. Some family of heat used it as a passageway. Men passed, laughing. One of them had a laugh that had not learned the difference between power and the imitation of it. When they were gone, they continued. The keep learned their footfalls and decided to forget them. At the postern, a door argued with its hinges. Jaime muttered the kind of cursing that is a friendly argument with fate. The door opened a third of its intention. Night lay beyond, soft and uncertain. The smell of river and of the city's old wounds came into her. They had not counted on the man with the torch who came around the corner at a run and skidded to a halt at the sight of them. He was not brave and he was not craven. He was a man whose day had already triumphed over his hope. He opened his mouth to yell. Daenerys did not think. She moved, the knife a silver decision, and her hand found the place under his ribs where kindness would be the wrong word for what she did. He gasped. His torch went down and then up again to catch. Jaime caught him as one catches a sack of grain. The girl took the torch and placed it gently against the stones until it died, as if that had always been its intention. "He will die," Jaime said, not accusing, merely reciting. "He would have called," Daenerys answered. "There are sounds I do not allow into rooms when I can help it." She had never before killed a man quietly in a dark corridor so that she might pass. She was either becoming the creature her enemies said she was, or she had always been that creature and had simply had no occasion to reveal it. She put the thought aside. There are evenings for philosophies. There are evenings for crossing thresholds. They slipped out. The night accepted them with the casual magnanimity of a host who has seen worse. The river lay like iron. Far under surf, a dog made a sound that was either a bark or a cough. The girl led. Jaime went last. Daenerys held the knife in her sleeve and the memory of the man she had gutted in her throat. They followed a path along the inside of the wall until a barge crouched in a shadow like something that had lost its courage. A man waited in it, his head covered by a hood that had been made out of a sack once used to store grain. He did not look at them. He put his hand up and gave a small shake as if to say, "Not yet, not now, not unless you want all of us to die." They remained in the shadow that carried the scent of old piss and patient moss. Somewhere above them a watcher cleared his throat and spit and then moved his weight from one foot to the other. The wall itself sighed. The boy with the gray eyes emerged. He had no tongue and thus had no reason to argue with fear aloud. He held a coil of rope and a bag that might have been flour once and was now simply a bag. He met Daenerys's gaze briefly, then looked away, as if ashamed to be seen in the role of savior. He slipped the bag and the rope into the barge and then made 3 quick movements with his hand that meant, Now, it must be now." They went down and the barge took them and the river carried both. The man in the sack hood pushed off with a pole and guided them into darkness that was not protection so much as a kind of mutual forgetting. The girl breathed through her nose. Jaime's glove creaked. The boy with gray eyes kept his head down. Daenerys touched the rope where the boy's hand had been and felt, in it, the promise of all rope, to hold when men cannot. They slipped beneath a bridge where men had promised each other many things and had kept only some of them. They slid along a quay where a man slept with his mouth open and dreamed of meat. They moved past a pair of boats that had once belonged to fishermen and now belonged to men who spoke more of killing than of weather. The river's skin was broken in small places where fish rose to speak their piece. The barge moved on. The city behind them made no sign that it had noticed. Cities are proud. They do not admit to loss. At a bend, The man in the sack hood left them in the shadows and murmured, "Wait till the bell." It was the first human voice they had heard since leaving the wall that had not tried to be some other thing. They waited. The bell told its truth. When it finished, the man guided them under a final arch where weeds clung to stone and rats set their whiskers against the air. And they came into a narrow ditch of water that turned and turned as if it had decided to coil upon itself rather than go to sea and become a thing so grand it would not be able to recall having been a ditch. The barge grounded. The man lifted a plank upon a low bank, and they climbed up and over and into a tunnel where an old smell had made a home. Here, at last, the boy looked up fully at Daenerys as if to imprint her upon something that would have to suffice for memory. His eyes were very clear. He put his hand to the scar at his throat as if to excuse himself for not being able to say goodbye. Then he pointed 2 taps to his chest, one to her, one to the world beyond the tunnel. "Promise." She made the same motion. He smiled, the smallest thing, and disappeared back toward his city. Jaime paused. The girl with the bean mark adjusted her lantern and revealed, in that small light, a door of the sort that appear in stories. Plain, stubborn, without ornament, made not to impress but to function forever if allowed. "This opens into a killing field," Jaime said. "I cannot go with you past it." "I would not ask you to," Daenerys said. She stood at the door, smelled the world beyond it, and thought of every door she had ever passed, opened or closed. She thought of a tent flap lifted to let in a wind that had promised rain and had brought another thing. She thought of a hall where men had bowed until their backs had learned a new language. She thought of a small wooden door in Karth behind which a man had told her lies so beautiful they had almost taught her to wish to be Lee. Et to forever. She thought of the door on Euron's ship and the door to her room and the door of her own mouth. "Go east to go west," a masked woman had said to her long ago in a perfume that had known the inside of at least 5 animals. Go back to go forward. She had not understood and perhaps still did not. But here was a door, and beyond it air that did not belong to a queen, a pirate, a spider, a lion. Air that had not yet learned what it would be asked to carry. She slid the knife into her sleeve until it nestled at the inside of her wrist like a small, contentious bone. She took the hairpin and set it deeper into her hair. She nodded once to Jaime. He nodded. The girl lifted the latched bar with a grunt and pushed. The door opened with a sound like a held breath becoming something else. She stepped through. The night was space. A field of tall grass rubbed itself against her legs and rose to her hips in a place where the city's light could not teach it to fear. Crickets insisted upon their own lives, passionately, as if that were all any creature can be expected to do. The stars were not brighter here, merely the same stars over a ground that remembered them better. In the distance, on some low hillock, someone had lit a small fire and bent over it with hands out, making heat's acquaintance without ceremony. To her left, the river went on telling its meaningful story and pretended for a moment that it had never met her. To her right, a line of low trees made of themselves a promise of cover and of unknowns. She breathed. The breath went further within her than it had in days. It touched, just briefly, the place in her where a dragon sleeps when there is no sky for him. The hair on her arms rose. She was not free. She was not safe. She was not even beyond the city's habit of reaching for what it had lost. But she was a woman with a knife and a hairpin and a friend in a cloak and a girl with a bean-shaped mark and a boy whose eyes were the seas when it chooses to recognize itself. She had her feet, and they learned the ground under them the way only feet can. She had a name that had not been taken from her. She had breath. She began to walk. Behind her, in a room that had become for a time a place where queens speak to one another, and then again a place where a single queen considers where to plant the next spear, Cersei sat at a table and drank and thought of doors also. In a room below, Qyburn wrote neat notes about the manner in which a certain woman had carried herself and what that might mean for how her body would respond to certain stimuli. In a courtyard, men moved like chess pieces hoping the hand was not careless. In a low garret, the boy with gray eyes lay down upon rope and dreamed of water that was not salt. In a stable's lean underservant, the girl with the bean-shaped mark kissed, once, quickly, a boy whose hands smelled of apples, because she had been brave and was allowed this one small cowardice. In a corridor, a man bled and leaned against the wall and counted backwards from a number as if a number could be a road one walks home. Ahead of Daenerys, the grass parted. It sounded like voices leaning against each other. She tasted metal again. Not fear, not yet, not quite. The memory of it, perhaps reluctant to leave. The air had something in it that had not been placed there by men, who are so fond of placing. The moon lifted itself from the ground as if it had been resting and now remembered its duties. She walked, and the earth carried her, and far away, beyond water and land and policies. A shadow turned over in its sleep and opened a golden eye and listened.